Remember that gossip about Kate Middleton, the Princess of Wales, before her cancer diagnosis? People wondered where she was. Was she even alive? The rumor mill went on and on and on. And it turns out that was exactly the point. According to a new report from a professor at Cardiff University, the online conspiracy theories about Kate were fueled by a Russian disinformation campaign. Digital disinformation experts said the campaign was calculated to inflame divisions, deepen a sense of chaos in society, and to erode trust in our institutions. Does that sound familiar? So maybe you're thinking, so what? I'm not easily fooled. I take everything with a grain of salt. I get it. But Russian disinformation campaigns are starting to spread well beyond our social media feeds.
You are fake news.
The former president may have coined the phrase to attack the media, but now the threat of actual
Fake news
is on the rise. Let's face it, trusted journalism is on the decline. Small, local outlets can't survive, and they're shutting down. The UNC Hussman School of Journalism and Media reports that across Texas, for example, 134 counties only have a single newspaper, and 21 others don't have any. That's called a news desert. Communities that don't have access to quality local news. These deserts are spreading, and when that happens, something else will try to fill the void. Sites like these are popping up online, but they're
fake news.
And they're all tied back to Russia. But the scary thing is, these sites are made to look like real news outlets. The DC Weekly sounds legit, right? But look closer. Those are pro-Russian stories. Some of them are even written in Cyrillic, the Russian alphabet. The Miami Chronicle and the Chicago Chronicle. All of them sound very official, and that's the point. But they're
fake news.
They're trying to trick us and push pro-Russian propaganda straight down our throats.
Well, joining us now is Patrick Warren, who actually helped uncover these websites, and he's the co-director of the Media Forensics Hub at Clemson University. Patrick, welcome to the show. It's good to have you.
Thanks for inviting me.
Okay, so what made you aware that there was something wrong with these websites in the first place, and how were you able to trace them back to the Kremlin?
Sure. So it all started with one story. One kind of remarkable story that percolated up through the social media ecosystem, and then we were able to trace carefully until it arrived sooner or later at DC Weekly. The story itself is kind of interesting. Let me tell a little bit about it. We saw some strange YouTube videos that seemed to implicate President Zelensky in a crime, but it was just like a single eyewitness testimony about this event that there was no corroboration for at all. That story then moved to some small newspapers in West Africa and Eastern Europe before moving to Russian-aligned outlets in Eastern Europe, and then finally appeared in this strange website, DC Weekly. Once we started digging a little more into that website, we saw there were several stories like this, basically brand new stories that were created from whole cloth, and really the only allegedly Western outlet that was reporting on them was DC Weekly. That made us very suspicious.
Well, thank you for doing the work to dig to the bottom of this story. As Chris was mentioning earlier, even some of the Kate Middleton stories that were out there circling around were from these websites. So what other kind of stories are they pushing?
They actually push three sorts of stories. Well, one sort is the kind I just described to you, where they invent them from whole cloth. Most of those are anti-Ukraine, anti-Zelensky stories. A second sort of story that they spread are just stories about divisions amongst the sort of Western allies. So divisions within the United States, divisions within NATO, things like that. That's where the Kate Middleton story actually propped up. And the third sort of story that they tell is a really interesting one. They're stealing story from real news sites, Fox News, New York Times, and they're using artificial intelligence to rewrite those stories in their own words and put a little pro-Russia spin on them. So they're able to do really thousands and thousands of these articles very quickly. They look legit. They are legit, except they have this spin. They're sort of presenting a funhouse mirror version of the world.
Patrick, how often are these sites popping up? How widespread is this problem? And I'm actually afraid to ask you, do you have a percentage of how many is actually out there?
Yeah, so over the past several months, we've found about 15 or 20 of these sites that are all run by the same operator. But the The way that they're set up is such that they're easy to replicate. So at first we saw one, and then the next month we saw two, and then the next month we saw three, and now I think last month we saw six. So given how growth works, I'm a little worried about where we're heading.
Yeah, keeps progressing. So explain how this works, because wouldn't it be suspicious if someone was just reading the news and all of a sudden there's a story and they're looking at local issues and all of a sudden there's something about Russian propaganda? Or is it that subtle, or are we smart enough to catch it as it's happening? How can this be effective?
I think most of us are smart enough to catch it. If you were going to read through DC Weekly, I think you would pretty quickly realize there was something a little strange. Didn't take us long once we started to look at it. Unfortunately, that's not how most people consume their news anymore. Instead, they get a one-off story from DC Weekly, they click on it, they read that one story, they click around maybe one more story. At that level of investigation, it's not obvious. It's not obvious at all. And so I think the solution to that is not to try to figure out DC Weekly is real or not, but rather to be careful about your habits of news consumption. You should find one or two outlets that you find very credible, you've had a long history with, that continue to provide you with useful and reliable news, and read those regularly or watch them regularly, rather than sampling whatever happens to come across your social media feed, which I'm afraid is how most of these stories end up in people, in the sort of the zeitgeist.
Right. Disinformation isn't new. I think the problem is how it's distributed and how far-reaching that goes. Patrick Warren, thank you so much for your time. We do want to talk about, because it really is important to know where your news is coming from.
2 in 3 U.S. adults say that fabricated news stories cause actually a great deal of confusion about the basic facts of current issues, and you can see why. And 2/3 of U.S. adults reported little or no trust in mass media.
You know, it's so important to fact check and cross-reference everything you read, evaluate it, and look for more than one source. As Patrick was saying, find some sources that you trust, that you think are reliable. This may help the 85% of people who are out there who are worried about the impact of online disinformation.
That's right. You can always come here to the News on Merritt Street to get the facts.